So I'd like to welcome everybody to another monthly program of the Rhinebeck Historical Society. Our goal as an organization is to preserve local history, and just as important, to share it with as many people as possible. So for those reasons, we've been doing programs open to the public since we began as an organization in 1967. We began to film our programs only 12 years ago, and we post all of them on our website, rhinebeckhistoricalsociety.org, and there are almost 100 of them up there to date. And we make them available at no charge to anyone who wants to view them. This has allowed us to share our history well beyond Rhinebeck. It even allows residents who were unable to attend one of our programs to see it later. So it's a benefit to everybody. The first program that we filmed actually was in March 2011, almost exactly 12 years ago. And our topic and our speaker that evening were frankly, the ideal embodiment of Rhinebeck history. No building in the town of Rhinebeck has more history attached to it than our topic this evening, namely the Rhinebeck Reformed Church. And Bud Rogers, our speaker this evening, breathed history. He passed away this past August at the age of 86 after a lifelong association with the church. And that association began with his own baptism in 1935 in the church. If there was a role in the church that demanded a serious commitment to service, Irving Rogers, better known to all of us as Bud, filled that role. He served as a deacon, as an elder, as sexton. He was a longtime walker for the annual crop walk to end poverty that was sponsored by the church. He knew everyone involved with the church, and he knew its history. If a new homeowner in town needed a new lease prepared so that the bank would approve the purchase, it was Bud who would make sure all the details were correct before the pastor would sign on behalf of the church. As a young man, Bud had learned the meat cutting business from his uncle, Frank Rogers. And a few old timers here in Rhinebeck might remember that it was Bud who listened carefully while he looked you in the eye as you placed your order at the counter at Von Heusen's on East Market Street. After he retired as the owner of the village meeting house, he refused actually to retire. He worked as a physical therapy aide at St. Francis Hospital in Poughkeepsie. And back here in Rhinebeck, he worked part-time at both Pitcher's Flower Business and at Rhinebeck Liquors. Some of his former colleagues and some he helped might remember Bud from his role as a volunteer with the Rhinebeck Rescue Squad. In all of those roles, as the writer of Bud's obituary correctly pointed out, Bud was a kind, sweet, and gentle man. His greatest passion, however, was his church. And he loved to talk about its incredible history. What follows this evening is Bud telling that story. His voice is quite soft, so you need to listen carefully. This is a 12-year-old video. It was well made, but it was primitive equipment. So if it doesn't come over clearly, it's not your speaker's fault. We think you'll enjoy this program as much as we did when we first filmed it back in March of 2011. And at the conclusion of Bud's talk, I will come back here for any comments or questions that you might have. So let's go to the actual presentation by Bud.
I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight in this inclement weather. And I want to thank Pastor Perez for letting us use the facilities, the wonderful Rhinebeck Reformed Church. We're going to have Bud Rogers, who's been with the church since the beginning of his life. We're going to have him talk in here because the church is kind of chilly. I also wanted to thank James Chapman, who's a Rhinebeck Historical Society board member, for donating the refreshments from the Rhinecliff Hotel. And if anyone hasn't joined the Rhinebeck Historical Society, you can speak to Mike Frazier at the end of the table here, and he can sign you up. And let's get the show on the road. Bud Rogers.
I hope my voice holds up tonight, and if anybody in the back can't hear me, let me know. Anyway, I was baptized in this church, went to Sunday school here. I went on to consistory when I was 21 as a deacon, and I went from there to elder, served off and on over a good number of years. And eventually, I was granted the title of sexton, which in religious terms means janitor. I've been doing that now for 5 years and pretty much enjoying it. Anyway, thinking of the church and going through the archives over the years, I got thinking mainly that the church was really a part of the birth of our nation. And the more I read into that, the more I realized how true it was. The players in this birth were three: the early Dutch settlers, the German Palatines, and the Beekmans and the Livingstons. So we have to put them all together or find out how they all got together as we go along. Now the early Dutch, the Low Dutch, who settled in Rhinecliff, had the first patent, which was a small one. And they worshipped over in the Old Dutch Church in Kingston. So in order to get there meant by boat in the summer, and sleds and horses in the winter over the ice. So they wanted a church of their own. So a few men got together and approached Henry Beekman, and Henry gave them some land, which is where they built their church eventually. In 1709, Robert Livingston hosted the German Palatines, who were refugees from starvation in Germany, and they went to Holland and then to England, and then the English wanted to get rid of them too, so they shipped them over here. And they came over at the time to be actually, I guess you'd call them indentured servants to Livingston, to make tar from the pitch of the trees for the English Navy. That didn't work out too well. Trees weren't exactly right, and so they were left adrift. The government didn't want them. Livingstons didn't particularly want them, but they were on Livingston's land. And eventually some of those made it down to Henry Beekman lands here. Excuse me. Well, when they came over here in 1709 by boat, there were two congregations, one Lutheran and one German High Dutch Reformed. When they got around to building a church, they built it by 99G. There's a little cemetery there on the hill just past Rudy's, and That's where they had their church. Lutherans and the so-called High Dutch Reform, which were the Germans. So you had the Low Dutch Reform down here, the High Dutch Reform up there. That's two parts. Now we get into the Livingstons. Henry Beekman had a daughter, Margaret, and she married Judge Robert Livingston. They had 10 children. Okay. I'm mentioning all these names because they were a very important part of this church and this country. The oldest was Janet, who married General Richard Montgomery, who was killed in Quebec during the Revolution. The second was Chancellor Robert Livingston, who took part in preparing the Declaration of Independence. He was minister to France and also ministered finance of the Louisiana Purchase. Number 3 was Margaret, so-called Angel of Linwood, which was her property, and she married Dr. Thomas Tillotson. Then we get to Colonel Henry Beekman Livingston, who had his own regiment during the Revolution, and he went to Quebec with Montgomery. Catherine married Reverend Freeborn Garretson, who was a ponyback rider of the Methodist Church. They came here and they wanted to start a congregation and wanted to use the church here at that time. And the consistory felt that these people were a little too far out to be here. They were Methodists. So anyway, Catherine, being married to Reverend Garretson, and being a sister of Janet, Janet gave him the land where this Methodist church is located. So that's how we tied those in. Gertrude married Morgan Lewis, one of the founders of St. James Episcopal Church. Joanna and Peter Livingston, or married Peter Livingston. Elida married General John Armstrong of the Revolution. And Edward, who was mayor of New York City, and he went on to become Secretary of State and Minister to France. Now back to the church building. The first one here was 1731. And I've never ever read a description of what that building looked like. I knew nothing about it. And today I was digging through some of the material I have got there. And there was another old history of the Reformed Church written there by our good friend DeWitt Cornell. I don't know how many of you remember Uncle DeWitt. Herman does. Ellen. But he was a great guy, and he was very interested in the church and the country. His byword was God and country. That's how it worked. But anyway, in that little description, he said the building was about the size of the Hillside Church. And if any of you know where that is, going down the 4-lane highway, sits up on the hill, this little chapel, and which isn't very big. And that was composed of, or this church was composed of benches. The door faced Route 9, and there were benches on the side for men and boys over 12, and the women and the children sat on the other side. And then there were a few places for the important people of the town who were part of the church up front. So, eventually, that church was in pretty bad shape, and they decided they needed a new one. So the present one was built in 1807, finished in 1809. Our good friend Colonel Henry Beekman was supposedly buried under the original church. In one book, another book said that he was buried in the graveyard of the church. When they built this church, they covered the grave. But there's no stone, no markers anywhere for Henry Beekman except a plaque which was placed in this church many, many years later. So we're not really sure what happened to Henry. So we have designated him our friendly ghost. When anything happens here that's wrong, Henry's been at it again. And Anna, our secretary now, says she hears footsteps every day upstairs over her head between 2 and 3 o'clock. And she says, I know there's nobody up there. So she's convinced that Henry's here with us. The church was built half with brick and half with stone. The south side and the west side are brick. The back side and the grave side, the graveyard side, are of stone. And that's because the people with some money purchased the bricks, and the farmers who had no money brought the stone. Now, the most interesting part that I got out of that is the fact that when they contracted the job out to this contractor from New York City, he agreed to put up the building, and the church would supply all the material. And the cost of putting up this building was $950. Now you talk about the value of a dollar in those days, or a lot. $950 to put up a church that size. Oh, another thing, speaking about money, something I came across in here, this was going a little bit out of line here, but in 1829, a member of the congregation loaned the church money with an interest rate of 27%. Now, when you think back in those days, these people who made money got to keep money. And with interest rates like that, you can see how people fast became millionaires when the time was right. We had slaves who appealed to the consistory in 1805 to attend this church and be instructed to become members. Now, there was nothing mentioned that they ever became members, but they said that that was a big move in those days, that they were even allowed to worship. We have a beautiful organ in our church. It was a Roosevelt organ and was purchased in 1894. And if none of you have, or if there's any of you that haven't heard it, come some Sunday and listen. It's great. There was an organ there before, and that was sold to the Lutherans up in the Stone Church up here. And that organ is still up there. Hand pump organ. And it still works. First electric lights went in 1901, and another jump here to 1950. Reverend Benetton, who grew up in this church, went on to become an Episcopal priest, gave the clock in the tower to the church, along with a bequest. Henry, when he gave this piece of land to the church, comprised 2 acres. And it goes from the corner to the end of the cemetery on back to, the parking lot back there now, but it includes that parking lot. And then comes back and right around again. So we have 4 places here, the real estate office, and the other building across from there, and the telephone company that pay rent to the church for that property. Because the church, according to the deed, was never allowed to sell any of it. Also, at the same time, he gave 44 acres of land to the east end of the village to the church for their use, for whatever they needed, stone, lumber, etc. That became the church land, and is still the church land, even though it's comprised of, I think it's 134 separate buildings on it now. And all of the people who live on there, including me, pay the church rent. The biggest one up until the time they sold the parsonage up here was $15. We have some that pay 50 cents a year because the larger lots were subdivided into smaller lots. And when they subdivided it, they still couldn't charge any more rent because that's stipulated right in the lease agreement that when the property is transferred, you can't raise the rent. So we have people here in our church now, why don't we raise the rent so we get some money? We can't raise the rents. Thank the Lord for that. We really good trouble. Would be humble. But anyway, that's something the church has had to deal with, because years back, banks would not take mortgages on any of that property. And people came here expecting to buy land, found out they couldn't get a mortgage because of the church. So the church took a lot of flack at that time. Eventually, the banks came up with this idea that if you pay your rent for the full term of the mortgage, which didn't amount to much, if you were only paying 50 cents a year, 30 years, or even if it's $10 a year, it was something that wouldn't even be noticed when you're buying property. So that kind of took the pressure off the church. Now it's even comical to a lot of people who move here. One person told me, he thought it was great. He says, what you should do every year is get dressed up in costume and go around on the date rent is due and pound on the door and collect it. There would be some people that might take offense in that too. So I don't want to be the one that collects it. Another interesting part of this church is our cemetery, which gained the title of God's Little Acre out here. And the earliest stone out there is 1731, which is just a piece of field stone with a date on it. The graves of Revolutionary soldiers are out there. And another mystery we came up with was the Livingston tomb. In 1806, the Livingstons asked the consistory here if they could construct a tomb for the Livingston family. And they were given the permission. In 1887, the consistory decided that the tomb was in very bad shape, and they tore it down. And they covered over where it was. And then they said they lost the location. I thought, there's a church, there's a cemetery, how could they lose the location of the tomb? But that's what the book said. And then we went further in the book, and Reverend Blanchard, who's here for 35 years, 1928 to 1955, and he wrote a history of the church. We have a little black book, which is in our library if anybody ever wants to come in and read it. when he first published it, they were selling it to church members for $1. And then after a while, they had so many of them that they were giving them to every new member who came, got a book. And then finally, they realized they were running out of books. So I think we, at that time, salvaged 12 copies. Some are in the archives, there's one in the office, there's one in the library. And so we're hanging on to those, so we don't let any of them out. But you're welcome to come anytime and look at them. Back to the tomb in Blanche's book, as I started in 1928, and I quote, "Recent researches have brought its location to light, and it will be now marked with an appropriate memorial by the descendants of those who sleep." I don't know where that memorial is. There's still no markers. Someone suggested that perhaps the plaques in the church, most of which were placed there in the 1920s, were the appropriate memorial. Maybe that's what they did. But I looked up the names of the ones of the people in the tomb, and they're not on the plaques there. They're all Livingstons, but the ones in the tomb are not the ones on the map. So it's still a mystery, and I have an idea that it was directly behind the church, where the playground is out there now. So anyway, that was interesting too, because at the time we were putting up this building, they did exhume a couple of bodies towards the back there. And that was all done legally with the undertakers and everything that was necessary. But Rick Aldrich, old Mrs. Aldrich was still alive. And they owned Roteby on the river, if you're familiar with the big houses on the river. And Ricky Aldrich, the son, is grandson, of old Mrs. Aldrich. And Mrs. Aldrich was in her 90s at the time we were doing this, and somehow she got the word that we were digging up the Livingstons. And she wanted an explanation, and she was going to look into it and sue us. And Ken Cordes was here as a minister at that time, and I happened to be on consistory. And he said, well, somebody should go up and talk to Mrs. Aldrich. And someone on the consistory said, well, I think that should be your job, Reverend. And he says, I don't want to do it, at least not alone. So I volunteered to go up with him. And we went up to visit Mrs. Aldrich. Very, very nice old lady. And she took us on a tour of the mansion. And she showed us one room in the mansion that was painted blackbirds all over the room. And she says, you know what happened? My son, who was quite a drinker, was on a bender, and he locked himself in the room for a week. And while he was in there, he painted blackbirds. And then I was reading a description of the mansion another time, and they had mentioned this room with the blackbirds, how beautifully it was decorated with the blackbirds. Mentioned about how it got that way. And anyway, she never mentioned, she took us all through, never mentioned the problem with the cemetery. And on the way out, our secretary took me aside and she says, we talked to her, and we explained to her that the Livingstons had been moved and they were buried elsewhere. And so she was happy with that. And so whether that was true or not, I don't know, because I did some investigating down at the Hyde Park Reformed Church. St. James Church, because there's a lot of Livingstons buried down there. But I didn't come up with any names of the people who were here. So as far as we know, most of them are still here with us. But exactly where, we don't know. So we might have a few more ghosts helping Henry out. It was interesting, in the 1950s, we had a man here for a very short time as minister. I think he was the first one here after Blanchard, so it must have been about 1955. And he was only here for 2 years. But during that time, he took a tour of the building, and some of the men took him up up to the tower, and you could overlook the ceiling of the church. And he happened to notice that the timbers were settling. At one point, they were just inches away from the domed ceiling in there. And we had people here for years, buildings and grounds people who went up there and worked. Nobody ever noticed that. So we had it investigated and realized that this was an ongoing process, and sooner or later that was going to come down. So they had the timbers all steel plated and tied in and whatnot back at that time. So hopefully now it's safe. But like I say, he was a gift from God, because maybe something would have happened if he hadn't come. This building was started in 1960, and it was started with a gift of $20,000 from Reverend Vanetton, who left us the clock. And I was 21 years old when I first went on consistory, real greenhorn, and the consistory met up at the Reformed Church parsonage. So by that time, our minister was John Arnold. And my first experience, consistory member, was Mr. Arnold, after we had settled in, getting up and saying, "This church is in darn poor shape, financially. And if something doesn't improve, I'm closing the doors the 1st of June. And this was in January. Wow, that was an awakening. And so something did happen, and that was when we got the $20,000 from Mr. Vanetton, Dr. Vanetton. And so what we did, of course, we were eager to pay all these bills that were piling up, but it was decided that we would take it was given in 2 gifts of $10,000 each. So when they came in, we scalped 1,000 off each time, and the rest was put into an educational building fund by the insistence of John Arnold, who was the same man who said he was going to close the doors. And so he wrote it out, but it was a hard ride for him because the church was pretty poor shape at that time. But it improved, and he was back here to visit us for 275th, and we had a great time together and a lot of memories. And another interesting thing, which I call a gift from God, is when we went to pay for this building, we raised $100,000 in pledges. Cost us $130,000. So we had a $30,000 mortgage, and we weren't able to pay anything on the mortgage except the interest because money was still very tight. And couldn't ask the congregation for more because they were still hurting from the other one. So along comes this gift, and I have to explain this gift because there was a man here in the 20s by the name of William Platt Adams, very active man in the congregation, a very influential man. He made friends with people like Tracy Dowse and other people of substance, money-wise, and he had the church in pretty good shape. And so he died somewhere before 1930. And in his will, he left everything to his daughter, in trust for his daughter, and it would pass on to her children if she had any children. Turned out she had no children, and so when she died, the money was spread out to different organizations, cemetery association. They built a chapel from that money that they got. And Dutchess County Historical Society was very active. And our gift was $30,000. So we paid off the mortgage. So I thought that was pretty neat. Let's see. We have a bell in the cemetery. Anybody see the bell or know the bell? Well, originally, that was found by our friend Uncle DeWitt Grinnell. Someone told him that the Coast Guard had these bells for sale, or they were willing to give these bells away, which were lighthouse bells. And they were storing them someplace, and they wanted to give up the storage place. So they were giving these bells to anybody. So naturally, Uncle DeWitt grabbed that in a hurry. And he placed it over by the back of the Rhinebeck Savings Bank, right on the corner where that thrift shop is there. And it sat there for quite a few years. And the bank was eager to get rid of it, but they didn't want to do anything to hurt DeWitt's feelings, so they did nothing. So as soon as Uncle DeWitt left us, they jumped on us if we could do something about the bell. Well, the Historical Society did. They picked up the job, and we agreed to have it put in the cemetery in memory of Uncle DeWitt. So there it is. So one day at a consistory meeting, we had a guest speaker, or a guest from Kingston, who was involved in the Roundout Lighthouse restoration. And he says, "You may not know it, but you have our bell." Really? Yeah. He went on to explain, because the bells are all numbered by the Coast Guard, so it matched up. And he says, "We want our bell back." And he says, "If you're willing to give it to us without a fight, we'll give you another bell." So we agreed to it. I said, "Well, if that's where it belongs, that's where it should go." Well, since that meeting, we've never heard a word from them. And I think one of the reasons is the fact that it's a pretty heavy bell. If you look at that old lighthouse, they were probably advised not to put it back up there. I'm just speculating now. But anyway, we haven't heard, so we still have the Roundout Lighthouse bell in our cemetery. When I first started working in the archives, I figured my first mission was going to get all the minutes, round them up, they were all over the place, and get them together. And I came across this book that said Minutes of Consistory, 1903 to 1939, all in one book. Oh man, what a godsend. This is going to be great. So I started reading. Minutes were about that long. They're attended by Mr. So-and-so, Mr. So-and-so, Mr. So-and-so. There might have been something mentioned about something that was totally uninteresting, and then was signed off. That's how they got all these minutes in that one book. There was nothing in there that was historically, at least in my opinion, valuable. But I did get this one quip out of it, that in 1913 there was a man here by the name of Dr. Baker, who was clerk of consistory. And whether we didn't have a minister at the time or not, but they had a meeting 1st of October, I think it was, the first meeting in October. And he announced that they were going to sell the parsonage. So I don't, they didn't, like I said, it didn't say anything more than that. But the parsonage was to be sold in 1913. Somewhere towards the end of October, there was a notation that Dr. Baker had died suddenly. The next meeting said the motion to sell the parsonage was dropped. So I showed that to our minister, Luis, and I said, better behave yourself. DeWitt, I loved the man. He was so great, and I think I pretty much covered this. And at one time, he was docent up at Montgomery Place, and so the date he was working, I went up to hear his spiel, and he took us to the house, and then we went out on the back porch, covers the whole back of the house. And he's standing there and talking about General Richard Montgomery, who was killed in Quebec, and it took them years to have the body moved from Quebec down, and I forget what year it was, 1818, might have been, when Janet was living in that house up there that she built after she was married. And DeWitt was saying that they brought the body back on the boat, coming down, and Janet was standing here on the porch, looking at that, and you could see in this man's eyes, he almost had tears in his eyes. He was reliving that whole scene. He should have been born in the Revolution. I'm telling you. He just lived and breathed history and church. God and country. That was his number.
And the fight and drum. Right.
Oh yeah. He was absolutely amazing. He brought a lot of fun to the village. Kept it colorful. And that's about all I got to say.
Bud was a real treasure, and we were very lucky to have him. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation, and Jeff, I'm going to turn it over to you and to the members and to see what questions or comments there may be. David had mentioned earlier, and I'd like to remind you, since there are a number of viewers this evening who are at the church and viewing it there, that if any of you at the church have a comment or question, you'll need to go to however Paul Niederkorn has set up his laptop if you wish to make a comment or join in the discussion. Okay, Jeff?
Thank you, Michael. No, we don't have any chatted questions yet. So as a reminder to anyone, if you want to ask a question or make a comment, you can send a chat to me, host Jeff, in the Zoom meeting, or you can go down to the reactions button and raise your hand and we'll call on you. And if you have your camera on and you want to say something, just give us a wave and open your microphone, and you can make your comments.
One of the comments that came in, maybe it was just directed to myself, Jeff, and I don't know that you saw it. I believe it came from Barbara Sweet. She encouraged, since we just have names here, a lot of folks don't realize that members who participate in our Zoom program come from all over. I see some of our members here from California. And what Barbara was encouraging the members to do was to identify where they are from. Yeah, I see there are some other chat comments. Jeff, I don't know if you can see where they're.
I only get the ones that are sent to me. You probably have
I see.
some.
Okay, well, let me see.
But I did get a comment from Wendy. Wendy says, "Excellent, such a gem for the village of Rhinebeck." Thank you, Wendy.
We have one from John Vincent, who's asking what the church basement archive current status is. John, I've been honored by the church to be able to do quite a bit of work in the archives there. I haven't done any recently, but it is, I mean, Bud was the person who served as the archivist for a church for a good while. And I've kind of picked up on where he, and actually we had several other folks who inventoried that archive. I think Steve Hubbard is here. There was, but it's the collection of documents goes back to the origin of the church, the minutes that Bud was referring to. Yes, there is a minutes book for the period 1900 to 1939. There are also minutes books going back to 1731 when Petrus Voss was the dominee of the church. And those minutes are absolutely fascinating. A lot of work needs to continue to be done. We've scanned quite a lot of the archives. Sue Quimby was a member of the church who spent a lot of time with me as we went through describing and scanning a lot of the material. And then more recently, Kathy Carl, both of them, Sue Quimby is now in Massachusetts and Kathy Carl in Oregon. But I need to go back and spend some more time, pick up where I left off, and hopefully there'll be somebody else from the congregation who's willing to be able to spend some time with me on that labor. It's really a very rich archive.
I do have another chat from Allison Wallen. Allison, if you'd like to unmute your mic and you can ask the question. You were asking about the pews.
Yes, I wanted to know, good evening, and what a wonderful lecture, truly. I wanted you to speak a little bit about the church remodel, and I don't know when that happened, when they took the front pews out and stored them somewhere.
I'm aware that,
I guess, go ahead.
yeah, I'm aware that there was a period when the pews were being moved, but I'm not familiar with the details of that. I'm sorry, Allison.
Okay.
Here,
Could you explain?
I've just added to the screen the folks sitting at the church. If there's anyone at the church tonight that knows about it, if you can unmute the microphone. It looks like not. Okay.
I mean, what I'm aware of is that, I mean, that occurred prior to the time when I was serving as archivist, and my understanding is that in order to be able to do some of the work that needed to be done to the church, pews needed to be moved. And, because I can remember there were some inquiries regarding plaques that had already, the pews were leased to individual members of the church, and among the more interesting records are the pew leases, and there was an amount that had to be paid initially to take title, I guess, for lack of a better word, to the pew, and then you had to pay a rental fee annually. And if that failed to be paid, then the pew reverted to the church. But then at some point, quite a few, decades ago, that system was no longer in effect. And even though there are still a lot of plaques identifying pews, and I think there were some images of that in the presentation, that in Bud's presentation. Many of those plaques are still there, but I know that some, at least in response to requests that I've gotten, I haven't been able to locate those.
We've also got a comment, another comment from Wendy, which is interesting. Wendy says, my family was the quote unquote poorer members who donated stone for two sides of the building. Tremper is the family name.
Ah,
We have a question from the church, I think. We have to unmute.
You need to unmute the device at the church. Go to the bottom left of the screen and click that little microphone icon.
You unmute them, Jeff?
To unmute. I can't unmute them remotely.
Is
There we
Paul
There we
present
go.
in the room?
Okay,
Maybe
they're
Paul.
unmuted now. Go on ahead at the
Okay, very
church.
good.
Hi, I'm Trudy.
you should be able to unmute yourself manually by clicking on the icon in the left-hand corner, bottom corner.
Yeah, they've unmuted. Go on ahead, please, at the
That's your
church.
question.
No, it's not a question, it's answer about the pews. I was also grown up in the church here. Came back after I retired, and it was just after that, I'm going to say 2002, 2003, we had an interim minister, Dave Hondor. And he was very handy also with carpentry. And the first two pews were removed. They're up in the balcony now to make more room in the front. I had heard that it was so that there was room for wedding parties in the front, because it was originally very, very close there. Also at that time, we had just introduced the music ministry team, and they didn't have enough room in the front of the church. Also made some changes to the screen in front of the choir and raised it, put it down farther. It's since been put back up, but the pews in the front are not. They're still up in the balcony. Does that answer your question?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Okay.
So I have a quick comment about the church. When I bought my house 20 years ago, my lawyer was trying to explain to me why I did not own my land, why I had to pay $9 a year rent for the church. And so we went through the closing, and I wrote checks to the lawyers and the title company. Said, you have one more check to write, $270 to the Rhinebeck Reformed Church. I said, what's that for? He said, that's 30 years of rent. The bank won't let you close on the house until they make sure that as long as the mortgage is in effect, you paid your rent. And then a week later, I went to see Bud at the church, and he pulled out the folder, the lot 33, which was my land. And he had all the records going back to 1810, when a John Pauling signed the first $9 land lease. And that was when my house was built. So Bud was wonderful, just wonderful.
Jeff, we have is Dorothy Oxner still with us? She has a comment. Dorothy?
I don't see Dorothy.
She's,
I'm here.
okay.
Yeah,
Dorothy, go
Dan
ahead.
here. Well, in the chat, I asked you a question about if there are initials on the cornerstone that say FR? And if there are, whose are they?
I've been in the church many times, Dorothy, but I'm a little embarrassed. I have never looked at the cornerstone.
It
So
would be
I'm,
on the outside of the church, probably in the
Yes.
cement section or the stone section. Yeah, I have a photograph of it and I thought it was on the church, but maybe it's on another church.
oh,
But it's
I
supposed
think
to
I
be
have your email address and I will
oh,
take a
good.
look next time I'm at the church and
Yeah, I'm a
uh,
member. Yeah, well, if those initials, I think, are Frederick Rao. Is that familiar, that name familiar at all in the church?
Lown.
Rao,
ROWE.
yes, right. Or originally it was RAU.
Okay, I mean, I'm familiar with that family name more so from the Milan area. There's the Rao Church near the Milan Town Hall east on Route 308, but I was not familiar with that name as in, as a member of the church.
Yeah, no, they're probably more in the Ulster County area.
That may well be.
It was a great presentation. Thank you very much.
There's a comment here from Jonathan Asher. Jonathan, are you still with us? And would you like to come on and unmute yourself?
Sure. I thought it was a great presentation. I'm sorry to learn that Bud passed. I remember him from Van Heusen's a long time ago, and he still has the same very kind face and demeanor. So really great presentation. I just thought it would be interesting for folks to know Edwin Jan Van Etten was my grandfather Strong's cousin. And when the Reformed Dutch Church clock was dedicated in 1950, Cousin Ed delivered the sermon such that just as he finished, the clock began to strike 12 noon.
Oh,
My mother telling me that, and I
wow.
was typical of Cousin Ed. He was a showman besides being a very good minister and renowned for starting, I think, some of the first radio broadcast sermons in the country, WKDKA in Pittsburgh.
Jonathan, you're probably speaking to us from your place in Massachusetts, I assume.
Yes.
John, for those who were with us on a recent program that David Miller presented, John Asher here was the donor of his grandfather's photo negatives, over 2,000 of them, that served as the basis of that presentation. Wonderful history of Rhinebeck, and thank you, John, for having passed those along to our care.
Well, great job by David and by you, Michael. So my role was minimal compared to what you all did.
Well, couldn't do anything without those kinds of gifts. John
Michael?
Vincent, yes, please.
I just wanted to mention that the balcony at one time was used for slaves and blacks to be seated in the church.
This is Nancy Kelly, our town of Rhinebeck historian.
And so I thought that it might be an interesting fact for people to include.
Yeah, especially since one of the comments that Bud made was a reference to a petition that was presented to the Reformed Church in the very early 1800s, asking if they could be members. I don't know if any action was actually taken to make them members, but they were participants in the services at the church. And as Nancy mentions, they were in the they sat in the galleries in the upper level of the church. And we saw some images of that area of the church during Bud's presentation.
Arthur, my husband, Arthur Kelly, transcribed the church baptisms. And I think that slaves are mentioned in the listings there.
I have a comment from Glenn Countryman. Glenn, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My family, my sister Carol is also in on this call. And our father was, we moved to Rhinebeck in 1951 and became members of the Reformed Church in Rhinebeck. And my father was a member of the consistory for almost his whole life, being a deacon and an elder, and also the clerk of consistory for many years. And as a child, we went to Sunday school there, and in the old chapel, I can remember several little things that are in my fond memory of going in and helping my father and the rest of the consistory members tear the old chapel apart and take it down and be a little part of the construction of the new building that you have there now. And we used to have a youth group on Sunday nights with Reverend Cordes, and we used to, as the building was being constructed, we would play hide and seek after the service part of our youth group was done, and we had a lot of fun playing hide and seek in the new chapel. While it probably wasn't too safe at the time, but Reverend Cordes let us do it, and it was just a lot of fun. Our father also had a good friend who was an engineer. I think he may have worked for General Electric, but I can remember him coming down to Rhinebeck to visit our family. And so he came up and he helped at one time. He helped to do some repairs on the organ. I don't remember what they were, but he also did help my father to repair the clock. So as a child, I got to go up with my father and his friend up into the clock tower, and it was just absolutely fascinating to me as a kid to climb up the stairs and the ladders and go up into the clock and around the bell and see it. So it was got a lot of fond memories there. And last thing I'll say, my wife and I were married in that church in 1967. So a lot of fond memories. Also, obviously, everybody knew I was in the Fife and Drum Corps with Uncle DeWitt, and obviously everybody was good friends with Bud Rogers. So it was a real pleasure to see this presentation tonight. So thank you for all you folks are doing.
I'm wondering, Barbara Sweet from Hyde Park is with us. And one of the topics that Bud spoke about was the work on the Livingston tombs and whatever happened to the bodies. Do you know whether any of the Livingstons that are buried in Hyde Park originated in our cemetery here? Barbara, are you still with us? Maybe not.
Barbara is with us, but her mic is muted and her camera is off.
Okay. Barbara Sweet, I don't know if you heard my question. I was curious if you have any comment on the Livingston issue that Bud Rogers spoke about, namely the question about where the bodies went. No, apparently not. Okay.
Still muted.
It'll remain a mystery, I guess. Okay. Is there anyone else who hasn't had an opportunity to say anything or make any comments would like to do so. I mean, it has been a real pleasure for us to be able to revisit this video that was made by Leanne Bishop for us.
I
in
thought
March
the
of
presentation
2011.
was fascinating. I'm actually in New York City, but I am an associate member of the DAR in Rhinebeck, and my son lives in Rhinebeck, and I would, next time I'm up there, I would love to see the church and the grounds. I thank you for this. It was a gift.
Great.
That was Sally Lemons speaking. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you, Sally. Okay.
Does,
Yes, was there someone else?
I do. I'm Betsy Ebers. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes,
Am
Betsy,
I-
you're
okay, I wasn't
coming
sure.
in from California?
Palm Springs, yeah. Can somebody comment about the interesting bell that ring every day at 5 o'clock? Do they still ring?
They do.
Okay.
Yes, quite a
does
bit of,
that happen?
well, quite a lot of work was done on the bell tower. I think, gosh, it's got to be 15, 20 years ago now, including on the clockworks. And they ring. I can't remember what the frequency is, but quite a few times in the course of the day, and they sound great. I'm often over at the Star Library, which is probably a half mile away and kind of on higher ground. And if the wind is in the right direction, I can hear those bells. And they really remind us that the church has been here a long time. And
Yes, they toll once for each hour on the hour, and they toll once on the half hour. And I live 2-3 blocks down South Street, and when my grandchildren are here, when that hour bell starts ringing, we stop and I have them count the tolls, and then they can tell me what time it is, and they think that's great fun.
I used to hear it at 5 o'clock. I didn't know that it was several times during the day, but I do remember 1 o'clock and 5 o'clock. So anyway.
To the credit of the consistory of the church and to the members of the church is exceptionally well maintained, both inside and outside. And that's not easy work. It takes an enormous amount of volunteer hours. It also takes an enormous amount of money to be able to do some of the things that have needed to be done. And some of the things are not visible at all, such as the work the church recently did on their heating system, boilers and the like. But all of that is critical. And fortunately, the church is blessed to have a very supportive membership. I'm not a member myself. I've been fortunate in being invited to do work on their archives, but yeah. Betsy, you had your hand up.
Also, I have another small question. When Bob was alive and we visited every year during October, there was a wonderful October festival there. Is that still in their schedule? Is that still a part of their yearly,
I believe so. One of the
It looks like Melody. It looks like Melody shaking her head no at the church there.
Oh, really? Okay.
Okay. I'm not in a position to make any comments regarding events that are planned for the church, but if Melody is saying that is no longer in cards, I'm sure that's what the story is.
Thank you.
Okay. Again, Anyone else with any comments?
So glad that everyone came to this event. It was exciting to have some people coming in from the church. We've had 96 videos over the last 12 years, and exactly 12 years ago, this was video number 1. And we thought that with Bud's recent passing, it would be a great way to honor him and all of his work for the church, and him being our first guest star on our very first video. And I'm glad that everyone enjoyed re-looking at this video.
Thank you,
Very
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bud.
Yeah,
And thank you,
enjoyed it
Reformed
very
Church.
much. Thank you, David.
Good
and,
night, everybody.
Good night.